I was born in Spain, specifically in a region called Galicia, which is in the northwest corner of Spain, just north from Portugal. My hometown is a place called Marin. It's got 25,000 inhabitants today. But my dad's family was from the bigger town of Pontevedra nearby, which has got 83,000 people in it. This is Pontevedra. As you can see, it's a pretty modern town, but it has a very sizable medieval quarter in it too. In the background, on the left, upper left, you can see a big bay that's called the Ria de Pontevedra. And that big bay goes into the Atlantic Ocean, which you can see in the background. If you were to walk along the shore on the left side, 4 miles away, you would end up in Marin, my hometown. My dad was an officer in the Spanish Navy. At the time when I was born in 1949, he happened to be stationed in the Spanish Naval Academy, which is located in Marin. So Marin is sort of like the Spanish equivalent of Annapolis, and my dad was stationed there, and I was born while he was there. So I ended up being born in a town just 4 miles away from my dad's own hometown, but it's pretty much by a coincidence. Later on, my dad was stationed in Madrid, and I grew up in Madrid, and I studied biology with a specialty of genetics. But in 1974, I decided to change careers completely. I went to do something called biomechanics, and for that, I had to go to the United States. So in 1974, I went to the University of Iowa. 5 years later, in 1979, I finished my PhD degree. I got a job at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. I was there from 79 to 83. In 83, I moved to Bloomington, and then I was faculty at Indiana University in Bloomington until 2013 when I retired. Now, while I was a grad student at Iowa in 1976, I wrote an article on a magazine. This is a non-scientific magazine. It was directed to coaches. And about a month or two later, I got a letter from a guy in Puerto Rico. This guy's name was Ramon Dapena. And he said that I was the first Dapena he'd ever heard of who was not from Puerto Rico. And he was very interested in knowing about the Dapenas in Spain and wanted to know where exactly we came from, and also maybe we might be connected at some point in the past. At this point, I was 26 years old. I had no interest in genealogy. I had never heard the word genealogy before, in fact. And I forwarded this guy's letter to my dad in Spain. And I also told the Puerto Rican guy that I knew that the Dapenas came from Galicia. That I had very clear. But I didn't know any more than that, really, and that maybe he should correspond with my dad and see if they could figure something else out. Now, this story, this Puerto Rican contact that I got here, it turns out that these Dapenas from Puerto Rico, I've never found any connection with them. But still, this contact that we had at this time turned out to be very important for our bigger story, as we'll see later on. In 1978, when I was a grad student at Iowa, I met an Iowan called Shar, and we got married about a year later. And Shar had a really big extended family. And to keep straight who was who, I began making diagrams to show me the relationships of all of these people. And in that process, I began looking at some data also in ancestry.com, and I became pretty much an addict to genealogy, to the point that I would be with friends of mine, and I would look up their families and do their genealogy work for them. But in all this time, I was not able to get anything about my own family because I could not find records for Spain in the United States. At least I couldn't do it at that time. So what did I know at this time? Well, I definitely knew my parents. This on the right is my dad, who we talked about him already. On the left is my mother, Ángeles Caro. She's from the south of Spain, and she's not part of this story at this point because we're dealing with an issue of my dad's family. At some point maybe we'll have another presentation about her, because there's some interesting stuff in there too. But right now we're concentrating on my dad's side. Who do I know from my dad's side? Well, he had a number of siblings, and I knew them, and I knew their children. But now if we go one generation further back, well, here we have my dad's parents. The guy on the right is my grandfather on my father's side. Notice the funny hat. That's because he's a cop. He was a special kind of cop called the Guardia Civil. They were Spain's rural police, and they have these funny hats that are designed in the 1800s. Well, in the 1980s, I didn't even know these two people's names. My sister Cookie did know them, so she told me what the names were, but even she did not know who were these people's parents in turn. No idea. Now, one thing that I did know is that in Pontevedra and also in Marin, there was this other Dapena family that, as far as we knew, they had nothing to do with us. But they were there. They were very numerous people. These two families got along pretty well. But, as far as anybody knew, there was really no connection between them. So that's me on the right side. And up there in the middle, there's another kid. This kid is called Andres Dapena. He's one of the other Dapenas. In fact, he was the son of the main doctor in town in Marin. And I don't remember ever talking with this other kid. One thing I did remember from him, he was 3 years older than me, so I probably never talked to him, but I did remember that he had very intense blue eyes, which is a fairly rare thing to find in Spain. So that's how I remember him. Now here, I want to make a little aside about my surname, Dapena. In the northwest of Spain, there's a special language called Gallego. It's something intermediate between Spanish and Portuguese. And part of the people speak Gallego. Everybody talks what you call regular Spanish, Castilian Spanish, but many people also speak this other language. And my surname is from this region. So the basic surname is Pena. Pena means rock, boulder, mountain. Now sometimes it's preceded by the word da, and da means of the. So Pena or Dapena, that's the same surname really, and sometimes the da gets glued onto the pena and you end up with Dapena, and this is the version I have. In Castilian, what you would call regular Spanish, these names sometimes get translated into Castilian. So instead of Pena, you have Peña, and instead of Dapena, you have de la Peña. All of these 5 surnames you see there, they all are exactly the same surname. You can have, from one generation to the next, you can have changes from any one of them to any other of them. And also, even within a generation, one brother may be called Pena, another brother can be called Dapena. And even for one person, that person at one point of his life may be giving one surname, and some other point of his life he may be given the other surname. Now in the 20th century, that is not happening anymore. Like my branch is called Dapena, and we're all Dapena. Nobody's called any of the other 5. But in points of the past, we have had all of these versions of the surname. In 2008, my dad passed away, and in the summer of 2009, I was in Madrid going with my sister over my dad's papers, and among these papers, I got a really huge surprise. I found that, you remember those Puerto Ricans that contacted me in 1976? Well, they had had some correspondence with my dad, and my dad had gone on a veritable warpath looking for genealogical information. What he was trying to do is he's trying to connect our Dapenas with the other Dapenas from Pontevedra and also with the Puerto Rican Dapenas. And in this process, he had found a fair number of people. He got a lot done. And what he did is he went to the Pontevedra parish church, and there he had access to the parish records, and he was just building the genealogy, going backwards. These are my dad's results from Pontevedra. Here on the left we have our own Dapenas, and on the right we have the other Dapenas. So my dad went looking backward in the church books until he reached the date somewhere around 1800, 1810, something like that, in which the church books stopped having an index. So from here on, he would have had to look page by page throughout the whole church book, so he quit at that point. All right, so what we have here is all of these people. There was a family tradition that said that because my dad was in contact with one person from the other Dapenas, and they knew each other from when they were young, so they were talking about this genealogy, and the other guy said that there was a family tradition that said that Jose Maria Pena, who is my guy on my top left there, that he was the brother of this guy called Marcos Dapena on the right side. And so that would mean that Domingo Pena, who we know was the father of Marcos Dapena, would also have been the father of Jose Maria Pena. But we couldn't find any documentation saying that Domingo Pena was really the father of Jose Maria Pena, and also nothing saying that Marcos was the brother of Jose Maria Pena. So my dad just kept them like this, separate from each other. Now, all of these Dapenas were born in Pontevedra, except for the guy in the upper right, the earliest guy from the other Dapenas. And he was born, my dad couldn't read exactly where he was born. It says born in the parish of, and he couldn't read it, but he could read that it was a parish near the town of Monforte. And Monforte is a town in the interior of Galicia, fairly far away from Pontevedra and Marin. This is a cute little castle in Monforte. So all of this gave me an opening. I decided to take up the project from where my father had left it. So my plan was simple. You go to the parish church in Pontevedra and go page by page through the earlier parish books, the ones that had no index. And another thing that happened is that I enlisted a great collaborator. This is Maica Freire. She is one of the other Dapenas. She is the genealogical nut of the other Dapenas, just like I am the genealogical nut of my own Dapenas. And Maica lives in Pontevedra, which is very helpful. She happens to be the niece of that little kid that was with me in grade school. Maica consulted with the official archivist of the municipality of Pontevedra, Enrique Sotelo. This is a man who knows absolutely everything about the history of the city. And he directed Maica to the Provincial Historical Archive of Pontevedra. This archive does not have any information on births, deaths, and things like that, but it does have censuses of the town and also wills and testaments. In 2012, Maica found in an old Pontevedra census someone who could be the father of my Jose Maria, and I was later able to confirm it. His name was Manuel Dapena. This meant that my Jose Maria and Marcos could not be brothers, since now I have a father for Jose Maria, and it's not Domingo. I couldn't figure out if Manuel was born in Pontevedra or elsewhere. So that was as far as I could get on my Dapena line in the Provincial Historical Archive. My next step was the parish church. This is where my dad had gathered all of his data. But I was in for a bad surprise. The parish archivist would not let me see their books. The church archivist is actually a very nice guy, and he gave me several good reasons why I could not be giving access to the books. One of them was that the parish was not set up to have anybody watching over me while I consulted the books, and people in the past had been known to physically abuse the books, some even cutting pages off with razor blades and running off with the documents. He did volunteer to get for me any documents that I might want. He didn't quite grasp the value of browsing and serendipity in the genealogical process, but oh well. But I decided to make the best of a bad situation, so I asked him to look for certain documents, and he did come up with a crucial piece of information. He was able to read the name of the parish from which the other Dapenas came. It was the parish of La Parte, near the town of Monforte. Monforte has a population of about 19,000, but La Parte is a very small rural parish, very near it, and it has a current population of 59. And in 1753, the population was approximately 165. So there's La Parte next to Monforte. So my plan changed. Instead of searching in the unavailable parish books from Pontevedra, I would search in the parish books of La Parte. Maybe I would be able to extend the tree of the other Dapenas further back in time, and with some luck, maybe, just maybe, I would be able to find a connection of my Manuel Dapena with the other Dapenas. The next question was, where could I find and consult these parish books from La Parte? It turned out that there were two places where I could do it. One of them was the archive of the Diocese of Lugo, located in the town of Lugo in the interior of Galicia. That was doable, but inconvenient because when I travel to Galicia, I generally stay near the coast. The other place was the microfilms kept by the Mormon Church. At that time, the Mormon Church gave access to their records in three main forms. Some records could be obtained by requesting a microfilm, which would then be sent to the local Family History Center in Bloomington. Other records, because of restrictions imposed by the institution where the microfilms were photographed, could only be seen in the computers of the local Family History Center in Bloomington. And finally, some other records could only be consulted at the Mormon Church's Family History Library in Salt Lake City. As my luck would have it, the records that I needed from the parish of La Parte could only be consulted in Salt Lake City. So, in October of 2015, Shar and I went to spend a week in Salt Lake City. I did find the other Dapenas in Salt Lake City. The first thing I found was that Marcos Dapena had not been born in Pontevedra but in La Parte. And then I was able to go back 4 or maybe 5 generations before Domingo. It's not completely certain that the Pedro Dapena at the top of the right column was really Eustaquio Dapena's father. So that's why he is grayed out. So let's take a look now at what these church records typically look like. We'll take a look at the baptism record of Vicente Dapena. That's the third guy on the right column. The document says, Vicente, on 26th of January of 1696 of my period of license, the scholar Juan de Lugo, resident of Santa Maria de Pino, a nearby parish, baptized and put the holy oils on a baby boy called Vicente Francisco Antonio. The godparents were the Lady Mrs. Inés de Quiroga y Osorio and I, Pedro de Soto, who at present am vicar of Santa Maria de la Parte. And his legitimate parents are Eustaquio Dapena and Ana Pérez, residents of Remuin. And because it's true, I sign it, Pedro de Soto. Remuin is a cluster of houses in the parish of La Parte. These data that I obtained in Salt Lake City were great for the other Dapenas of Pontevedra, the column on the right, because the data took them all the way back to people born in 1670 and maybe even 1640. But my own Dapenas, the column on the left, they were still stuck in Manuel Dapena. So far, I had achieved nothing for my own side. An interesting person, whom I found in the records from La Parte, was someone called Manuel Pena. His baptism record said that he was the son of Bernardo Pena and grandson of Ignacio Pena. Records from this period give the names and places of residence of the baby's parents and grandparents. Therefore, this Manuel Pena was apparently the brother of Domingo Pena. So let's readjust the branches on the right side of the slide to reflect this. Notice also that this Manuel Pena closely resembles my Manuel Dapena from Pontevedra. The name is the same, and the year of birth is the same. Could they be the same person? All this looked promising. Maybe we could establish the linkage of the two Dapena families from Pontevedra, and maybe we could take their common trunk back to ancestors born in 1670 or even 1640. But there were two important doubts that cast a shadow on such conclusions. The first point of doubt was the less troubling of the two, and it affected the connection between Bernardo Pena and Domingo Pena. The baptism record of Marcos Dapena said that his father was Domingo Pena and his grandfather Bernardo Pena. We would expect the baptism record of Domingo Pena to say that his father was Bernardo Pena and his grandfather Ignacio Pena. And if I had found such a baptism record, there would have been no problem. However, I never found the baptism record for Domingo Pena, and this presented a problem. Domingo Pena's mother was Comba Rodriguez, but Manuel Pena's mother was Luisa do Casar. This gave us two possible scenarios. Option 1 would be that Bernardo married Comba Rodriguez, and they had a son, Domingo Pena. Then Comba Rodriguez died, and Bernardo Pena married Luisa do Casar, with whom she had a second son, Manuel Pena. Option 2 would be that there were two Bernardo Penas. The first Bernardo Pena married Comba Rodriguez and had a son, Domingo Pena. The second Bernardo Pena married Luisa do Casar and had a son, Manuel Pena. If option 1 is what really happened, then the tree is correct as drawn in the image. But if option 2 is what really happened, then the family line that goes back from Andrés Dapena to Domingo Dapena would have nothing to do with the line that goes up from Manuel Pena to Eustaquio and possibly Pedro Dapena. I thought option 2 was unlikely. This was because Bernardo is not a very common first name in Spain, and therefore it's unlikely that there would be two separate Penas called Bernardo in La Parte at about the same time. My guess is that there were 90% chances that option 1 was the correct one, but I couldn't be totally sure. The second doubt was a much bigger problem. Were these two Manuel Pena or Dapenas the same person? In favor of this possibility was the fact that they both had the same first name, and also that they were born in the same year. But there were two facts that made me doubt. First of all, Manuel is the third most common boy's name in Spain. It's as common as John in the United States. Every family has a Manuel somewhere or another, so there could be a Manuel in the Dapena family from Pontevedra, and a different Manuel in a separate Dapena family from La Parte. Second, we had nothing to suggest that the Manuel from Pontevedra had anything to do with the parish of La Parte. In fact, if it had not been for the existence of the other Dapenas from Pontevedra, whom I trace back to La Parte, it never would have occurred to me that the Manuel Dapena from Pontevedra might have anything to do with La Parte. I guessed that the odds that these two Manuel Pena, Manuel Dapenas were the same person were about 50-50. So I saw this as a very serious question mark on the whole family tree. My first approach to solve these problems was to look at wills and testaments in the area around La Parte. My hope was that I would find a will and testament of Bernardo Pena saying something like, "I was married twice, the first time to Comba Rodriguez and the second time to Luisa do Casar." Or something like, "I leave 2 oxen and 1 plow to my son Manuel, who is living in Pontevedra." Well, I found wills and testaments for the area around La Parte in the Mormon Church microfilms, and these they did send to Bloomington for consultation in the local Family History Center. However, I did not find any will and testament of Bernardo Pena, nor of anyone else that would be of any help in solving my problems. So I had to take a different approach. This second approach consisted of genetic tests. I needed to compare my DNA with the DNA of someone in the other Dapena family from Pontevedra. I asked Maika if she could find a Dapena from her side who might volunteer to do the test, and she did. The volunteer was her cousin Andres Dapena, born in 1975, who is the son of the Andres Dapena, born in 1946, who was in the photograph from my elementary school. If the test indicated that my DNA and Andres' DNA were similar enough, it would mean that we're closely related and that the entire tree is correct. If the test indicated that my DNA and Andres' DNA were too different, this would mean that we're not related and that there's something wrong with the family tree, either in the connection between Bernardo and Domingo, or in the identity of the two Manuels, or in some illegitimate birth or births in either of the two branches. In any DNA test, you will be comparing your DNA with some other person's DNA. And to do this, you pay a company, and this company sends you a kit, and this kit has in it a swab that you put inside of your mouth. You rub it against the walls of your mouth, and that swab will have some saliva and some cells from the wall of your mouth. And you put that in a vial, and you send it back to the company. And the other person does the same thing. They also send their swab to the company. Then the company is going to find out this sequence of elements in your DNA. It's going to look also at the sequence of elements in the other person's DNA, and then they will compare the two to see if they're similar to each other or not similar to each other. That is the basis for all of these genetic tests. Now, at this point, I had to decide what kind of genetic test to do, because there's several different kinds. Here's the three main kinds: autosomal DNA test, mitochondrial DNA test, and Y-chromosomal DNA test. We're going to deal first with the autosomal DNA test. Every person has 23 pairs of chromosomes. One of those pairs consists of the sex chromosomes, called X and Y, which determine if a person is going to be a male, that would be XY, or a female, that would be XX. The other 22 pairs are called autosomes. So your autosomal DNA comprises almost all of your DNA. Your autosomal DNA is the combination of tiny bits and pieces from the autosomal DNA of all your ancestors. The slide shows an individual at the bottom and that person's 5 previous generations. So you can see the person at the very bottom, then you can see 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and so on, all the way to 5 generations before the individual at the bottom. This yellow outline indicates people who share parts of the autosomal DNA. All of them share some autosomal DNA with the person at the bottom. When you compare your own autosomal DNA with that of another person, you're trying to see if you have some of those little pieces of DNA in common with each other. If you do, it means that you have some ancestors in common. If you have a lot of DNA in common, it means that your common ancestor was very recent. If you have very little DNA in common, it means that your common ancestor was more remote. This test works very well when the common ancestor is recent, like 2 or 3 generations ago, maybe up to 5 generations ago. But it does not work so well when the relationship is more distant. Bernardo Pena is supposed to be 6 generations away from me and 7 generations away from Andres. Therefore, the autosomal test was not the tool of choice for our purposes. We're going to look now at the mitochondrial DNA test. You can make an analogy of a human cell with a fried egg. The yolk of the egg would be called the nucleus, and the egg white would be called the cytoplasm. The chromosomes are contained in the nucleus. The mitochondria are very peculiar organelles located outside the nucleus. They are in the cytoplasm. Mitochondria have their own DNA. It's called mitochondrial DNA, and it's completely independent from the DNA of the chromosomes. From a genealogical standpoint, the mitochondria have a very important characteristic. They are transmitted without changes from a mother to all her children. Men receive mitochondria from their mother, but they don't transmit any of their own mitochondria to their children. The mitochondrial DNA is transmitted from a mother to all of her children. If I'm the person at the bottom of this diagram, I have the same mitochondrial DNA as my mother. My mother has the same mitochondrial DNA as her own mother, and so on. The light blue outline shows the people with whom I share the same mitochondrial DNA. My mitochondrial DNA will be different from the mitochondrial DNA of all the other people in the diagram, other than those in the light blue outline. Mitochondrial DNA tests can be useful for figuring out if two people are connected through a purely maternal line. But in the particular situation that we're discussing, we need to track purely paternal lines. Therefore, mitochondrial DNA tests are not useful to us in this case. The third type of genetic test is the Y-chromosomal DNA test. Only men have a Y chromosome, and this test is used to compare the Y chromosomes of two men. The Y chromosome is passed from a man to all of his sons, practically without any changes. Therefore, I have the same Y chromosome as my father's father, and so on, as indicated by the green outline in the slide. The Y chromosomal DNA test is very good for testing if two men are connected through purely paternal lines. Therefore, it's a perfect test for what we are trying to do. This is a DNA molecule. It consists of two chains that wind around each other, forming the famous DNA double helix. Each chain consists of many links, and each link has a chemical compound attached to it called a base. The bases are represented in this graphic by the spherical pellets. If we separate these two chains, take one of them, and straighten it out, it would look something like this. Instead of the pellets from the previous slide, each base is represented here by one letter. There are four kinds of bases: C, G, A, and T. They all have their particular names. You don't have to learn the names. It's just C, G, A, and T are the four bases. This sequence of letters from the Y chromosome is normally transmitted from father to son without any changes. So I pretty much have the same sequence of letters as my father, as my grandfather, as my great-grandfather, and so on. But occasionally, there's a change in one or another of the letters. This is called a mutation. Now, giving enough time, there will be mutations. For instance, if you compared me with a direct paternal ancestor of mine from 100,000 years ago, we would definitely find differences in the letter sequence. If the comparison is with a direct ancestor from, say, 4,000 years ago, there will also be differences, but very few. If the comparison is with a direct ancestor from 1,000 years ago, it's very likely that there will not be any difference. When we compare Andres' Y chromosome DNA with mine, if the letter sequence is different, it means that Bernardo is very unlikely to be our common ancestor, because the 200 years between Bernardo's birth and the births of myself and Andres would not have been enough to accumulate any or hardly any mutations. Therefore, if the letter sequence turns out to be different, it would mean that the family tree is wrong. But there's a problem here. If Andres' sequence of letter is the same as mine, it does not necessarily mean that Andres and I have Bernardo 200 years ago as our common ancestor, because our common ancestor might be somebody else, 800 years ago, or 1200 years ago, or 50 years ago. So the problem is that the comparison of the letter sequences does not have enough resolution as a test. It cannot distinguish between a common ancestor 50 years ago, or 200 years ago, or 1,000 years ago. So this is a big problem. But there's something that is going to help us to solve this problem. The letters in the regions of the Y chromosome used for these tests do not look quite like I have shown them here. They come in repeated sequences. Look, for instance, at the first three letters of the sequence in this slide, CTA. In a real chromosome, they will be repeated, as you can see in the following animation. So the 3-letter sequence was repeated 5 times. The same thing will happen to the next 3 letters, GAG. In a real chromosome, they will be repeated. So they were repeated 7 times. The next trio of letters, TCC, will also be repeated. In this case, there were 3 repeats. And the next 3-letter sequence, ACT, will also be repeated. In this case, there were 5 repeats. These are called short tandem repeats, or STRs. The number of repeats in each STR will change over time, and it will change much more quickly than the letters themselves. So let's say that someone in this room and I have a common ancestor 500 years ago. Our letter sequence will almost certainly be the same: CTA, GAG, TCC, ACT. However, I may have the STRs shown at the top: 5 repeats, 7 repeats, 3 repeats, and 5 repeats. But the other person may have 6 repeats instead of 5, and then 7, the same as in the second group, 2 repeats instead of 3 in the third group, and maybe the same number of repeats in the fourth group. So overall, we find that there are 2 differences in the number of repeats between this other person and myself. So this kind of test, looking at the STRs, gives us much greater resolution, which allows us to figure out approximately how far back our common ancestor was, even if it was just a few hundred years ago. The company that I used to compare Andres' DNA with mine was Family Tree DNA. There are other companies like 23andMe, and there's others, but I just chose to use Family Tree DNA. In an STR test, you compare the number of repeats in your own Y chromosome with the number of repeats in somebody else's Y chromosome. The STR test does not analyze the whole Y chromosome. It only looks at several specific points or markers within the Y chromosome. Some tests look at very few points. There's a test that tests only for 12 markers. This is called the Y-DNA 12 STR test. But there are other STR tests that look at more markers, up to maybe 500 markers. The more points in the test, the more accurate the precision of the prediction for when your common ancestor was, but also the more expensive. I made some calculations and figured that the Y-DNA 37 test, which looks at 37 markers, would be the best compromise between price and accuracy for my purposes. We know the combined mutation rate of the 37 markers. On average, it takes about 5.5 generations to have one STR mutation when you do this test with 37 markers. So one or another of those 37 markers is going to have one change in every 5.5 generations. So from Bernardo to me, there are 6 generations. From Bernardo to Andres, there are 7 generations. So there's a total of 13 generations between Andres and me. If we divide 13 by the 5.49 number of generations it takes to get one STR mutation, you get a value of 2.4. So that means that we should expect to find 2.4 STR differences between Andres and me. Of course, you cannot have 2.4 STR differences. So you have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, but you cannot have 2.4. So what does the number mean? The 2.4 value means that if Bernardo really is her common ancestor, we should expect to find, on average, 2 or 3 STR differences between Andres and me, with 2 being slightly more likely than 3. But mutations happen randomly, not systematically. Therefore, we may not get the exact result that we expect on average. We can make a comparison with a coin flip. If you flip 100 coins, on the average you expect to get 50 heads and 50 tails. This is because each coin has 1 head and 1 tail, and each one has the same probability of occurring. But if you actually do the experiment, you probably will not get exactly 50 heads and 50 tails. Maybe you'll get 47 heads and 53 tails, or maybe 54 heads and 46 tails. Results like this will not surprise you. But if you get, for example, 92 heads and 8 tails, this result will be so far from the average expected value that you will suspect that something fishy is going on, something is wrong. It'll probably make you suspect that part of those coins might be trick coins with 2 heads. In other words, you will doubt that your initial hypothesis, that each coin has 1 head and 1 tail, is wrong. With the Y-DNA 37STR test, we have a similar problem. If Bernardo is the common ancestor of Andres and me, we would expect on average to find 2 or 3 differences between us. But that may not be exactly what we get. So then, how should we evaluate our results? Well, before getting any data from FTDNA, I decided the following rules for interpretation of our results. If we get 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, or maybe even 5 differences between Andres and me, I would conclude that the test is positive. We are so similar that we can say that Bernardo is the common ancestor of Andres and me. On the other hand, if we get a lot of differences, say 20 differences, or 43, or 10, or 36, I would conclude that the test is negative. Bernardo is not our common ancestor, and Andres and I are not related, and the tree is wrong. If we get 6, 7, 8, 9 differences, I would say that the test is inconclusive. We would not know any more than we did before we did the test. The test found that there were only 2 differences between Andres and me. So that's pretty much exactly what we would expect if Bernardo were our common ancestor. So the conclusion is that Bernardo is our common ancestor. This dispelled all the doubts that we had about the family tree. So the connection between Bernardo Dapena and Domingo Dapena was correct. Manuel Dapena on the 2 sides, those 2 guys there are the same person. And also there is no illegitimacy between Bernardo Dapena and the fork there and me, and between Bernardo Dapena and Andres Dapena. So this is the final family tree. Shar and I finally met Andres personally in Pontevedra last September. He is the guy to the right in this picture. And you can see from the drinks that we really like the Y chromosome test. And that's it. Thank you very much.